I love my super fluffy dressing gowns, but they are not appropriate for the super hot months that we sometimes get in the UK, and we've been getting more of them, so I decided to bite the bullet and make the 7875 dressing gown from McCalls. I decided to film the process of making it as well because I did want to make a few changes and tweaks to the pattern. All in all, I love this dressing gown. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. I've made it in this Liberty cotton lawn. It's the Lodden print, and whilst this technically is directional, or at least it has a very definite horizontal print across selvage to selvage of the fabric, I decided to go for it anyway with a full circle skirt because it was a full circle skirt, and because whilst technically a directional print, it's also a very busy print, so I think I get away with it. I really like how it's turned out. I did prioritise getting the print the correct way up along the centre front and the centre back, so the side seams are squiffy, but that's not the end of the world. I really wanted to use this fabric for a garment like this. I initially bought it to be pyjamas, but I don't wear pyjamas, so I then switched to thinking about making a dressing gown with it, and I had this pattern in my stash and decided to go for it because 5 meters of this are just about the right amount that I needed. I did have to piece the sash because I was trying to be a little bit fussy about print placement across the body and centre front and centre back of the seams of the dressing gown. Not that I've pattern matched, but I did try and make everything kind of like a line, and I think I did that quite well. It is a little shorter than I thought it was going to be. I mean, technically I could easily have measured it and made it so that it would have been floor length, but I kind of think it's a good idea that it's not, because as I mentioned, I only had just enough fabric from the 5 meters to get this version out, and also with floor length things I do tend to drag them through stuff, so having this mid calf length has actually turned out quite well, I think. One of the things that I did change about the pattern is I added pockets, and I stole those pockets from the pyjama bottoms that come with this pattern. I can't believe that they didn't put any kind of pocket in the dressing gown, and these were really easy to modify and add into the dressing gown. One thing I will say about the pockets is they need to be bigger, so that is the change that I would make if I make this one again. I'm not sure I'm going to make another one for me, but my mum has tried this on and she absolutely loves it, so I will be making another one for her at some point. So larger pockets will be designed and included in that dressing gown, but it would be as easy as just adding like another 2 inches around the curved edge of the pockets, or however much room you want to add to your pockets when and if you make this dressing gown. So definitely err on the side of larger pockets than the ones provided with the pattern, but the pattern pockets do give you a really good starting point. Something else that I decided to add was hot pink piping. I have a lot of this piping made for a project that you will be seeing very, very soon, and it is going to be a full piping tutorial of all the different tips and tricks that I use to get an even and neat finish with piping. But I wanted to test a few things out and try and see if I could do some techniques with piping and thinner fabrics like this one before I moved on to the piping overall tutorial, which as I say will be coming up very soon. Whilst I love the finished garment and I'm really pleased with this fabric, it probably wasn't the best fabric to pick for a sew along. However, all of the slightly trickier parts like French seaming and seam pockets do have their own standalone video, which I will include both in the cards and also in the description down below, which are hopefully made in a fabric that you can definitely tell the right and wrong side of, so it's slightly easier to follow. I'm really happy with how everything turned out. I think this dressing gown looks amazing. I have made some tweaks which I will talk you through when we get to the sew along part of this video, but the very quick review is if you have this pattern and you happen to have 5 meters of a cotton lawn, I 100% recommend this dressing gown pattern. I think it's gorgeous. I'm so happy that I have it, and I will be wearing it a lot over the warmer months. I need a summer weight dressing gown because my giant pink fluffy one is not going to cut it in the hotter months of the year, and we do have some of those in the UK. So I have chosen this one. I'm going to be doing view C, but without the quilting. I like the quilting, but I kind of think that for me I would want the quilting to be or I would want the collar, belt and cuffs to be a different fabric to the main fabric if I was going to quilt it, so it'd stand out more. I've also picked a really busy print, so I've decided I'm just going to do this view but with out the quilted details on the collar, belt and cuffs. You see the long one. I have got my pattern out and I have written myself a list of all the pattern numbers that I need to trace out. I am also going to trace out pattern piece 11, which is the side front, but I can use that as a pocket, and the dressing gown itself doesn't come with pockets, which I think is a mistake. One of the only times I actually want to have pockets in there. So I'm also going to trace out piece number 11, and I write myself a list like this so that I can cross the pieces off as I go, because in the past I have forgotten pieces and I've folded up the tissue paper and I have had to get it all out, iron it and trace it again, which is annoying. According to the envelope, I should be getting between a size large and extra large, because I have a 40-inch bust, a 27-inch waist, so that puts me in the medium, and then 40 kind of 3-ish hips, which is between the large and the extra large. I have the pattern pack that goes up to a size medium because I know McCalls build a lot of ease into their patterns. The finished garment measurements for this one, they only have the bust and the biceps, so that's on pattern pieces 1 and 4, which is over there. The medium has a finished garment measurement of 40.5 inches, which implies that they are expecting you to have about 4.5 inches of wearing ease in the garment when it's finished. I think this is going to be fine for me. I prefer a tighter fitting garment. I wear viscose PJs and t-shirts to sleep in, so I don't have bulky anything for this to go over. So I think the size medium is going to work for me, and I'm going to have to make it work because I only have this bundle. I've ironed all my tissue nice and flat so that I have ironed out all of the creases in the tissue as it came out of the packet. Personally, I am a tracer, so I'm going to go ahead and trace off the size medium of all of these pattern pieces and tick them off as I go. I have all my pieces traced and cut out. I don't need to make any alterations to the skirt pieces. This is the skirt back, and we've got the skirt front here. I've also got the pocket and the tie piece, or the belt. The belt doesn't need any alterations. And I just wanted to show you what I've done with the pocket. So you can see, hopefully here, the original top line of the pocket when it was meant to be part of the trousers. The way that I sew my pockets in, I like them to be mounted into the waistline of the garment as well as the side seam, because I find that it helps support whatever you put in your pocket, and more often than not it's probably going to be my phone that goes in here. So I have lined up my pocket with the side seam, and I am just going to add in the double notches because there's 2 notches there, and that will help me match everything up when we sew later, because I will be French seaming those in. But you can see, well, hopefully you can see the original line of the top line of the pocket went across like that, so it would have been sort of like hanging free, or I would have had to have curved it around, and that's quite a tight curve for such a small piece of fabric to go in easily. So I basically just added onto the top of this pocket here, which means that this is going to fit perfectly into the waistline of the dressing gown once it's made. So that's the only alteration I made to the pocket, and there's no alteration to the skirt front or the skirt back, as I mentioned, or the belt. So I'm going to put those pieces to the side, and I'm going to grab the bits that will need altering. Okay, first up we have the sleeve, and I'm going to draw in the seam allowance and then measure how long this sleeve is going to be, because I don't think that's going to be even remotely long enough for my personal preference or actual arm length. Okay, so the sleeve itself is 16.25 inches long. The cuff is 3 7/8. I have a fraction calculator, highly recommend. 3 7/8 plus 16.25 equals 20 1/8 inches. So I'm going to take my tape measure and just measure from my shoulder to my wrist. 23 inches. So I need to add 3 inches of length to the sleeve to get it to sit where I personally want it to sit, and I prefer my sleeves to be a little longer than shorter. This does have a lengthen and shorter line, which is just here. I have got a standalone video up here on doing that if you want to do that for any other pattern. The other thing is the biceps is 14 inches around, which gives me an inch of wearing ease, and personally I think that's going to be too tight for my preferences. So I also want to add an inch of width to this sleeve, and because I'm doing that to the sleeve I need to do that to the cuff as well, because they obviously sew together pretty perfectly. So I am going to add an inch of width, 3 inches of length, and an inch of width to the cuff to match the sleeve. We'll add the length first. Got a scrap piece of paper. I'm going to draw a line, and then I'm going to draw another line 3 inches above that. My ruler is only 2 inches wide. I could have got my quilting ruler out, but I'm being lazy. So I have my 3 inches that I want to add to the length of my sleeve. As I said, there's a lengthen and shorten line which I've traced here, and the grain line goes through that perpendicular, so that is the registration point that we need. So I'm going to cut through the lengthen and shorten line all the way along, get my Scotch tape. I'm going to line that cut edge up with the bottom of my 3-inch parallel lines. So the grain line, I'm going to continue that up through that 3-inch box, and then I can match up the cut edge of the top of the sleeve and the grain line, making sure everything is nice and even. Stick that down. Okay. That's slightly bubbled. There we go, and tiny little bit of tape this end. I want to match up the sleeve. Now I'm, as I say, wanting to add width to this, so I'm going from the underarm seam right to the seam where it joins onto the cuff, and I've only added like 1/4 of an inch both sides. I need to tape up these bits because we've added to those. Do that both sides. I'm probably going to end up retracing this sleeve because it's going to end up with a lot of tape on it, which is fine, but fold my pattern pieces up and put them into A4 file folders. These can get very bulky, and then when you take them out and to iron them flat for using again if you want to reuse your pattern, which is why I traced in the first place, ironing it with all this tape on it can make it very crinkly and you can gunk up your iron. So given the amount of tape this is going to end up with, I probably will end up retracing it. I'm going to cut out my new longer sleeve. Now I am going to grab my quilting ruler. I am going to draw a line from the notch or large circle at the top of the sleeve all the way down, and I have made sure that that line again has that parallel running through the lengthen and shorten line. So on the pattern this is usually marked as a large circle for the shoulder seam, but I always put it as a notch because I just find that easier. So that's my preference, but when you, or if you do this pattern, it will be a large circle. So I've gone from the large circle all the way down to the lengthen and shorten line. So we're doing the same thing basically. I want to add in an inch of width, so I need a piece of paper that is going to be long enough and wide enough. In fact, I'm going to add 1.5 inches because I may decide to wear this over slightly chunkier pyjamas. Not that I own very many of those, but you never know. On my long piece of paper, and I am drawing my markings. It's 1.5 inches wide. And we're going to do the same thing, except this time we're going up the pattern piece. We've got lots of registration marks to make it fit back together again. Now, you can do a full bicep adjustment. That would work really well, and that way you wouldn't need to alter the cuff in any way. This way I am adding a lot of extra room at the sleeve cap, so I'm going to actually put in some decorative gathering to make this fit into the arm side. I like that look, so this works for me, but you might decide that you don't want excess gathering the sleeve cap. You might just want to add in the extra width for the bicep, so a full bicep adjustment is a definite option. I don't have one of those on my channel, but there are loads of really good tutorials, so I will try and link to one that I have used before in the description down below. So just do it for both of these. But that lengthen and shorten line, doing the same thing. I've taped my cut edge, and now I'm going to match up the other side. Do you see what I mean about the amount of tape that's being added here? So I've added 3 inches of length and 1.5 inches of width. I am going to retrace this, and for the sleeve cap I don't want to add any puff to the top, so I'm just going to fill that gap in, and then it was 1.5 inches, so that means that 3/4 of an inch is halfway, and remark my notch. And then we've got the 2 dots here that were on the pattern that mean that you are to run your E-stitches from dot to dot. So I've just added an extra bit of room in there, which will be great for my bicep, and it will also mean that I'll end up with a little bit of gathering at the top of my sleeve, which I personally like. It might not be for you, but it is something that I enjoy. I'm going to get this retraced and then we can alter the cuff. So there's my original sleeve and there's my new sleeve, and as you can see, no tape. And I have transferred over all the markings, the grain line, the biceps point. I've made note that it's now 15.5 inches instead of the 14 that we started with, and I've also put here that I've added 1.5 inches to the width and 3 inches to the length. So now that we've done all that, I need to make my cuff match up with my sleeve, because as you can see, this is now too short. So I have got the notch here, which is the matching point for the cuff and the sleeve, and then I've made a little mark where I added the width, so I'm just going to make a little mark there. We can put this to the side and spare scrap of paper. I am going to draw a line in the same place that we added width to the sleeve. So I'm going to draw my 1.5 inch parallel lines there. The grain line for the cuff is actually on the bias, so I am just going to make another little registration mark so that it goes together easily. Cut up that line. Continue that registration line, and these edges are, or these cut lines are slightly curved, but it's such a slight curve that over that 1.5 inch is not going to make that much of a difference. So I will cut this piece out, and I'm not going to retrace this one because there's only a little bit of tape on this one, and I can fold this in such a way that when I want to get it out again, I won't need to iron over the tape. For example, I could fold it there so that when it fits into the folder, and then when I get it out, I only need to iron this bit, not over any of the tape. I now have my new sleeve and my cuff that fits. So this can go to the side, and then we can work on the bodice. I have 3 parts for the bodice here. I've got the collar, the bodice front, and the bodice back. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to draw in my seam allowance and then measure how long this is, because it actually looks quite long, but I know it's not quite right for me. So 5/8 of an inch seam allowance at the top and the bottom, and then I can measure between those seam allowances, and it is 16 3/8. And I need it to be 17 inches long, which means that I need to add 5/8 of an inch to the length of this bodice to make it work for me. There are no lengthen and shorten lines on this, which is really frustrating. I don't like it when patterns do this. And what I would usually do is pick the double notches on the side here and add length there. But let's think about this. If I add length under the double notches of the bodice, that's above the dart, so it's going to interfere where this is, so with the apex of the dart. So what I really want to do is add in length just under the dart, sort of around about there. That I'll match up the waistline of my piece and just make a mark there, because I want it to be kind of in the same sort of area. So I'm going to draw a line across there, and then I'm going to draw a line in across there. So those are my length and shorten lines for the bodice, and if I add my collar back on top, matching up its line, I can just add that lengthen and shorten line there. So I need to add 5/8 of an inch to all 3 of these pieces. Again, same deal as before. I'm going to grab a scrap piece of paper, draw a line, draw my line 5/8 of an inch up from that, and cut out my pattern pieces. Okay, this one's slightly different. If I put in a perpendicular line here, it's going to end up with a bit of a jog in it. So what I'm going to do is cut through this line, stick the bottom down, draw a straight line from this edge, which is the centre front edge, and then match that piece up with it like that. And then I can smooth out this curve. I will use my French curve for, because it's not like a dramatic one, but just adding a little bit of width to this piece just to make it flow nicely. So I didn't do a registration mark, I just lined up this edge and then I've redrawn that curve just to give it a nice flow. So I have added the length I've needed, and then I've just added a little bit over here just to make that flow nicely. And if we bring back our bodice front, you can see that the length and short lines match up nicely. So that's all the alterations that I need to do before I can cut this out. Next step is iron the fabric and get everything pinned in place.
Cutting out this fabric was a little challenging as I had two individual lengths. One was 3 meters, one was 2 meters. They were definitely cut from different bolts because the print quality or the print saturation wasn't the same on both cuts of fabric. Once I decided which way up I wanted the print to run, there probably is a right and a wrong way to have the Lodden print running, but I just picked the one that I liked the look of the best. Once I had chosen what was the top and what was the bottom, I made sure to continue that whilst cutting out all of my pattern pieces so the dressing gown looked cohesive. I cut out my skirt pattern pieces on a single layer of fabric. I didn't have enough fabric to be very particular about pattern matching over seams like the centre back seam, so I made marks on my paper pattern where certain portions of the print fell, and then when I used that pattern piece to cut out the second portion of the skirt, I made sure that the motifs were lining up. Even though the seam isn't pattern matched, the motif was running straight across the centre back seam and also the centre front seams of the skirt pieces. Once I had got the largest pattern pieces cut out, I then had some pattern pieces that needed to be cut on the fold. So I very carefully aligned the fabric and went through and made sure that the very linear design was matching up and not a little bit squiffy over the fold. That took a little bit of time, but it was definitely worth it, and it will make the final garment look a lot better if the linear part of the design is running very straight from side to side. It's a little bit time consuming, but totally worth doing. Again, I didn't have enough fabric to properly pattern match where the cuff and the sleeve seam met, so I just aligned those pattern pieces together as best I could so that the design would look continuous down the sleeve, even though it wasn't going to be perfectly pattern matched across the seam. The fact that I'm using piping also helps break up this seam and disguise the fact that it's not properly pattern matched. I did also cut out the front bodice pieces on a single layer. I didn't get any footage of that. I did the same thing that I did with the skirt back and skirt fronts. I made marks on the paper pattern where particular parts of the print fell and used those marks to cut out the corresponding front piece so that again the linear pattern ran across the bodice in a pleasing way.
As ever with me, I'm going to be starting completely out of order with the skirt, which is step 30. The first thing they want you to do is sew the centre back seam together at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to do this with a French seam because I'm using a cotton lawn, which is a very light fabric, and it will work really well. And I'm going to get that centre back seam sewn first. So I'm going to find it from my pile of skirt pieces. So got my pockets there. I believe this is probably the front. Yes, that's not got the triple notches on it, so that's a front piece, which means that's probably a front piece too, which means this is a back piece. Yes, that's the back piece. which means this is also a back piece. These pattern pieces were big enough that I needed to cut them on a single layer, so I have used my color-coded pin markers. For me, orange pins are always stopping pins, and they also indicate the back of the garment, and yellow pins mean the side seam. So I've got a yellow pin on my side seam and an orange pin on my center back seam. I'm going to get this skirt piece off of the pattern piece, put that away, and get these pinned together, wrong sides together, so I can start my French seam. So I have the first part of my center back seam sewn. I have sewn at 1/4 inch with the fabric wrong sides together. I'm now going to French seam my inseam pockets. So I'm going to open out my fabric, and I can take my side seam pin out now. I'm going to take one of my pocket pieces, and the pocket pieces have double notches in them which match up with the double notches on the side seams of the skirt. This is not the best fabric for the right and the wrong side. The wrong side is slightly kind of just not quite so crisp as the right side, so I picked a terrible fabric for a sew along basically. I do have an entire sew along for how to do French seamed inseam pockets, which is up here if you would like something with maybe a slightly clearer fabric. But basically what I am going to do is I'm going to take the wrong side of my skirt piece. I want a pocket piece, and I'm going to put the pocket piece on the wrong side of my skirt, and I'm going to match everything up, and we amended the pocket piece to match up with the waistline when we were changing the paper pattern earlier in the sew along. So that's going to get pinned into place, match up the double notches which are just there, and I'm going to sew that at 1/4 inch from top to bottom, stopping where the pocket meets the skirt, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and I'm going to do that for both of the back panels and then the 2 front panels as well, paying special attention to getting it onto the side seam of the front panels, not the center front seam. Ask me how I know. So 1/4 inch, wrong sides together, pocket pieces to skirt back, and then pocket pieces to skirt fronts. I have my pockets sewn wrong sides together with my front pieces and also the back pieces, and I have sewn at 1/4 inch from the top of the pocket down to the bottom of the pocket. I am going to trim off the seam allowance, and as I say, there is a full tutorial on this which has a slightly clearer fabric to see in, but basically what I'm going to do is snip into the seam allowance up to the line of stitching that attaches the pocket to the skirt piece, and then I am going to trim the rest of this seam allowance down to 1/8 inch, and I want to be really kind of precise about this particular piece I'm cutting off because I'm going to sew my next part of my French seam with another 1/4 inch seam allowance so that the pockets are slightly inset into the side seams. So I want to really make sure that I am trimming close to, but obviously not through, my line of stitching, so that when I press everything it's all going to be enclosed, and I'll be able to sew another line of stitching at 1/4 inch to enclose this entire French seam. This really helps if you have properly sharp scissors. I bought these Kai snips or teeny tiny embroidery scissors a while ago, and they are starting to blunt. They are not sharp right to the tip, which is not great. So I'm going to see if I can have these sharpened, because the sharper your scissors, the more accurate you can be. There are certain parts of this French seam process where it's very easy to cut through things that you don't want to if your scissors are not sharp right to the tip, which these are definitely not anymore. So I've got my French seam spaghetti, and hopefully you can just about see that there is a notch there. So this seam allowance is still intact on the main body of the skirt piece, but the pocket seam allowance has been trimmed down to 1/8 inch. I'm going to do the same for the other 3 pockets, and then I'm going to take this over to the ironing board, and I want to press everything flat and over so the seam allowance is going towards the pocket, and then I'm going to press it so that that seam that we've just sewn is enclosed. You want to press it flat like that before you try and press it together, because that will help you get a nice crisp edge when you are putting everything together like that. So I'm going to get all the rest of my pockets trimmed and then pressed. I'm also going to trim my centre back seam at the same time as I'm doing my pocket seams, because I do have to get up to go to the ironing board next, and so that makes sense to do the next process in the skirt, which is trim the centre back seam, French seam beginnings. So all of this trimming, then pressing. I have pressed my pockets completely flat and then over, and I have then finished off my French seam at 1/4 of an inch, and I've done that for all 4 pockets. I now need to take this back over to the ironing board, and I'm going to press the pocket outwards and press all the seam allowance into the pocket bag, and I'm going to do the same for all 4 pocket bags. The other thing that I have done is finish off the centre back seam French seam, and I've done this at 3/8 of an inch, whereas the pocket bags were all sewn at 1/4 of an inch, as I said, to inset them into the side seams. So I'm going to go and give everything a press again, and then we can start putting the front and back pieces together. So I have pressed all of my seam allowance and pockets outwards, and this is how it's now looking. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to take my front skirt piece, and with the wrong sides together, I am going to place the skirt front over the skirt back, and I'm going to match up the pocket bags and the side seam, and I'm going to pin all of that together, wrong sides together, and then I am going to sew from the top of the pocket all the way around, pivot here and down to the bottom of the skirt piece, and I'm going to sew at 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to repeat on both sides, and that's the first part of the French seam for the side seams. I have sewn the front to the back all the way around the pocket bag and down the side seam at 1/4 of an inch, and now I'm going to trim everything off. The one thing you do want to be really careful of is this little join here, pivoted at a right angle in the sewing, but you want to trim and clip into this corner so everything turns through nicely. This is an area, if your scissors aren't sharp to the tip, where you can cut through your stitching. Ask me how I know. You can darn it if that happens, but obviously be very careful when you're trimming away all your seam allowance. So we want to trim all of this excess seam allowance away to 1/8 of an inch. We're going to do that for both sides. I have pressed my side seams and my pocket bag so that everything is nice and flat, and I've paid particular attention to this intersection here just to make sure that everything is lying nice and flatly in this area. This is the problem area in this particular procedure, so this is the one to pay particular attention to make sure that everything is lying where you want it to when you press it. So now that everything is nicely pressed, I am going to sew from the top edge of the pocket bag all the way around, pivot here and down the side seam at 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same for both sides. I have finished off my French seam at 3/8 of an inch all the way around, and I pivoted here and then carried on 3/8 of an inch down there. So you can see the initial line of French seaming to put the pocket into the fabric will mean that the pocket is slightly inset. The other thing that I think you can just about see here is that I have sewn a line of stitching up from that 3/8 of an inch and backstitched here, and that's just to make the pocket a little bit smaller, but also to mean that where the hand goes in and out of the pocket, this is the area that's going to be under tension rather than this area. And then I've done the same at the top. So there's a line of stitching from the waistband 2 inches down, and it's 3/8 of an inch away from this folded edge, which again means that this pocket will be inset when I turn the work round and it is pressed into place. And you're going to press the seam and the pocket to the front of the garment, because obviously we want the pocket to be accessible towards the front, and we will, once it's all pressed, we're going to baste this top edge into the waistline of the front skirt piece. So 2 inches down from the top, make a little mark, and you want to stitch 3/8 of an inch away from the folded edge of your French seamed pocket. And then this piece here, I've gone 1 inch up from the pivot point, and I've backstitched here, and then I've just carried over that little bit of sewing there to reinforce it a little bit extra and backstitched here. So that's all nicely French seamed. So I'm going to go and press all the seams towards the front, and then we can baste the top of the pocket to the waistline of the front skirt. The pocket has been pressed forwards, and I have basted the top of the pocket to the waistband of the front skirt, so that when I French seam this together with the bodice later, it all goes together neatly. And then on the outside, I have got a nicely concealed pocket which is inset into the side seam. So the skirt is finished. I haven't referred to the pattern instructions since I mentioned step 30 because the pattern itself doesn't actually include pockets. The pockets, as you saw, were stolen from the trouser or pyjama parts. So none of the pocket instructions were actually in the pattern instructions at all. Sleeves next. I fibbed a little bit. I'm going to actually start working on the cuffs next. So step 21 for view A, and it's the same for views B and C. You'll just have quilted your cuff before you come to sew it together. I'm not doing quilted cuffs, so I'm sewing mine together along the short edge, matching up the notches. So these notches here. This cuff does have a top and a bottom, so the longer edge with the notch in it is the top. So that is something you want to just be conscious of when you are sewing the cuffs together or cutting them out as well. You have a directional fabric, you're making sure that the notch is at the top on the right side of your fabric. This really isn't the easiest one to see if the right or wrong side is, but I'm going to match up these short edges of all of my cuffs, 2 of which are interfaced as per the pattern and 2 of which are uninterfaced. Pin those together, and then we're going to sew that seam at 5/8 of an inch and repeat for all 4 cuffs. The uninterfaced cuffs are going to be the cuff facing, and the reason we have 4 pieces of fabric rather than 1 piece that you fold over is because the top edge is slightly longer and curved, very slightly, but it is slightly longer and curved. So these are the interfaced ones, and these are going to be my outers. I'm going to pin those together, and I'm going to get all of those seams sewn at 5/8 of an inch, and once that's done I will press those seams open. I have 4 tubes now, 2 interfaced, 2 uninterfaced. I'm going to take 1 uninterfaced, 1 interfaced tube. I'm going to turn my uninterfaced tube so the fabric is the right way out, and again making sure that the bottom and the top don't get mixed up. The bottom is the shorter of the 2. I'm going to insert the tube into the interfaced one, matching up the seams that we've sewn so that the right sides are together, and I'm going to pin this into place, making sure that my seam allowances are pinned open, and then I'm going to be sewing around the bottom at 5/8 of an inch to stitch these 2 pieces together. This should fit in perfectly. If it doesn't, that means that you may have got the bottom and the top mixed up, which is fairly easily done because it's not the most dramatic of differences between the 2. As I say, the top edge is the notched edge as well, if that helps. So I have an interfaced cuff and an uninterfaced cuff right sides together, and I'm going to sew around the bottom edge 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to repeat for the other cuff. I have sewn the bottom edge at 5/8 of an inch, and now we want to do some understitching, which is step number 25. So you want to understitch the facing. So basically what we're going to do is turn everything the right way out like this. And personally I don't like to press my pieces before I understitch. I prefer to understitch first and then use the understitching to help me press it the way that I want it to go. So what we're doing is we are going to be sewing in the tube, and it is possible it's just going to be a little bit fiddly, and we want to sew all of the seam allowance to the uninterfaced side of the cuff, so the facing of the cuff, and we're going to be stitching 1/8 of an inch away from that previous line of stitching all of the seam allowances to the facing. So I'm going to get that done for both cuffs, and then I can go and press this. Hopefully you can just about see, but I have understitched all of the seam allowance to the facing side. So now I'm going to take this over to the ironing board, but if I turn this through now, it's already wanting to sit exactly how you will want it to sit even before you iron it, because of that understitching, which is, as I say, why I understitch first before I do any ironing. So I'm going to go and press that all the way around, and then we can add the piping, and I'm going to do pressing for both cuffs. The next step is to add piping to the cuff, and you want to make sure that you're adding the piping to the outside, not the facing side, and you can tell the difference because the facing side is the one with the understitching and also the outer cuff is the one with the interfacing on it. The previous step does say to baste the top edge together, which you can definitely do if you have a fabric, for example, if you're making this out of a viscose, which is very slippery and might not want to behave as well as this cotton lawn is, but I'm finding this cotton lawn wants to stick together and behave itself quite well. So I've chosen hot pink piping. I do have a piping tutorial coming out very, very soon where I talk about how to make piping so that it works for the seam allowance of the pattern that you're using. Most of the patterns I use have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so that's what this piping has. I have put it all around the top edge, and once it is actually sewn to the bottom of the sleeve, that's how it's going to look. First thing that I do is I'm going to work with my piping in my lap. I'll unroll way more than I need so that I can have this in my lap and have no tension on it. There is a join there, but that's not the end of the world because it's made with bias tape, so the join is at a diagonal, so I'm going to leave that in there. The very first thing that I'm going to do is pull out the cord that I've used, and in this case it's baker's twine, and I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance I'm using for this pattern, and cut that little bit off. So I've cut 5/8 of an inch of the piping or the baker's twine that I've used out of the bias binding that I have wrapped it in, and I'm just going to push that back over the edge. And to be fair, the piping or the cording that I've used is really, really fine in this one, so I probably could get away without doing this step. If you've got thicker cord in there, you definitely want to remove the cording that goes into the seam allowance of the piping that you're using. So for this piece, I have now got a bit at the end here, 5/8 of an inch, which is just fabric, no cording. I am going to turn my cuff inside out, so I have the facing and the understitching on the outside, because that's just going to make it easier to stitch on the inside of this loop under the sewing machine. I find this easier to manipulate. I'm going to put my piping onto the seam of my cuff, and that 5/8 of an inch that I've left free, I'm going to actually put that this side of the seam, and I'm going to start stitching at the seam. So I'm going to start stitching about 5/8 of an inch away from this raw edge. I'm going to keep the raw edge of my piping up against the raw edge of my cuff, and I'm going to sew the whole way around, and then I will stop around about an inch away from the seam again, and I'll show you what that looks like when I get there. So as you can see, I have stopped sewing about an inch away from where I started sewing, and I now have two flapping ends free. The end that I've taken the piping cording out of already, I'm going to leave alone. This end, I want to remove 1.25 inches of the piping. I have cut it so that it's a little bit longer than the 5/8 of an inch that's been taken out of this piece of piping here. So I'm going to, with my tweezers, just peel back the covering, and I want to take off 1.25 inches because that is two 5/8 of an inch seam allowances together. So I'm going to snip that off because basically, like, I want 1.25 inches kind of like hanging free. So now if I fold these down together, the piping ends kind of meet. That piping finishes there, and that one finishes there. So there is a tiny little bit in the middle here where there isn't any cording anymore, but that's not the end of the world, because the next thing that I'm going to do is unpick this stitching. Now this is just my preferred method of doing this. As I say, there's a full in-depth piping tutorial coming up very soon. This is just my preferred method of finishing piping like this in the round. So I'm unpicking all of the stitching that held the piping together, and I purposefully stitched it with a longer stitch length so that removing these stitches would be easy at this stage, because again, like I say, this is my preferred method of doing piping, and I've left this a little bit longer than it needed to be, so I'm just going to trim off a little bit of this excess fabric. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to fold this back on itself, so that creates a nice clean finished edge for the piping. And then the original piece, I'm going to pick that up and sandwich it in between that folded edge that we've just made. And you're going to finesse this a little bit, but you want to end up with something that looks like that. And I'm going to then finish off that stitching that you can see here in white to attach this piping to the cuff. As I say, just finesse this little bit here so that you don't end up with a big jog in it, because you want it to look as seamless as possible. If you have the patience and you don't mind unpicking quite a lot, you could totally do a bias join here. I personally don't want to make that much effort. This is already probably more effort, and it's definitely more effort than the pattern suggests for piping. And I think this is a nice finish. And I've also got this on the underneath of the cuff, because this is the underneath seam here. So this is something that's not going to be really seen that often. So I'm going to move all of my tools out of the way, and as I say, join that line of stitching up from where I've backstitched there to where I've backstitched there, just to finish that off. That's that tiny little bit of stitching done. So if I turn this the right way out, I now have two cuffs that have their piping attached. Once this is attached to the main sleeve, that's what it's going to look like. So it's going to be a really teeny tiny hint of pink, but I think it's going to look really, really nice. One thing I would say is I've used white top stitching or white stitching here to secure this to the cuff. I would switch over to the colour of piping that you're using. I would switch your threader over to the hot pink for me, or whatever colour that you've chosen for your final piece, only because you will find that the stitching can show a teeny tiny bit, and if you have used the same colour as the piping, it's not as obvious or in your face. But I wanted you to be able to see what I was doing and talking about. So now that the cuffs are done, I'm going to actually move on to the sleeve. First thing it wants you to do for the sleeve is add in the E-stitching at the cap of the sleeve between the small circles. I have my sleeve here. I use a notch for the shoulder seam, which is usually indicated as a big circle on patterns, but I prefer a notch. It's easier for me. And I have put in the two small circles. So I've put pins through the pattern, through to the fabric, and then I'll peel the fabric back. And on the wrong side, I'm using my friction pen. I've just made a little mark in red so that I can see the small circles, and I've done the same for both small circles. So now that that's done, I'm going to take the pattern piece away. On the wrong side, small circle to small circle, which are marked with red dots, I'm going to run a line of E-stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then 3/8 of an inch away from that, which will mean that I'm sewing into the visible part of the garment. I know that the fabric will recover well from having a needle puncture holes in it, so I am not worried about putting gathering stitches into the visible part of the garment. But if your fabric is particularly delicate, you want to test this type of gathering method out before you use it. So from small circle to small circle, 3/8 of an inch away, don't backstitch at the beginning and the end, and the longest stitch your machine will do. Once you've done that 3/8 of an inch one, 3/8 of an inch in from that initial line of stitching, and do the same for both sleeves. The next step is to stitch sleeve seam. Obviously I'm going to do this with French seams, which means that I need to take my sleeve and put the wrong sides together. And again, if you have a fabric like mine that's not the easiest to tell, make sure that you are getting the wrong sides together. And I'm going to sew that seam at 1/4 of an inch, trim, press, sew it at 3/8 of an inch, press, and then it will be done. And I'll do the same for both sleeves. I have finished the underarm seams and I have pressed them towards the front, and I've done that because I will press the side seams of the bodice towards the back, and I want to be able to nest the seam allowances when I French seam the sleeve into the bodice. The next thing that we need to do is attach the cuffs. I thought I would test my theory before I went through the steps of showing you how I got there, but I have, of course, French seamed my cuff onto my sleeve, and I really like how it looks. So the first thing that you are going to want to do, if you want to follow along with me, is you are going to turn your sleeve right way out, and you're going to take your cuff, and that's going to be wrong side out. So I've got right side of my sleeve and wrong side of my cuff, so we're going to have wrong sides together, which is the start of any French seam. And I'm going to match up the seam on the cuff with the underarm seam of my sleeve and pin those together. And then turns out my alterations to my drafting and my cuff and my sleeves from earlier worked, and that they have come out the same size. So once I've got that one pin in, I'll then pull everything taut and I'll pin in the opposite side and quarter it, as it were. This is just so that it makes sure that I'm not ending up with any bubbling anywhere else, and I'll do the same in the other direction. And then if I need any more pins, I'll put those in, and then I'm going to sew around at a 1/4 of an inch, just like you would with any other French seam. Now, there is a lot of fabric here because we have the two cuffs, we have the sleeve, and then we have 2 layers of the piping as well. So there is a lot of fabric in this seam, which is why I was wondering whether a French seam would work for this, because it is going to end up quite a lot of layers in here. And as I say, and as I have shown you, it does work. But I would say that if you're using a thicker fabric than cotton lawn like this and viscose for the piping, you might want to consider a different seam finish. You could always use an overlocker, you could use bias binding, although that would add extra bulk after the fact. But like I say, I've tested it out, and whilst I have ended up with a fairly thick seam around here because the fabrics of themselves are quite thin and well behaved, it's not actually overly bulky, and it's in the right kind of area. If this, say for example, if this, all of this was in the underarm seam or the sleeve seam, I probably would have gone for a different finish, probably would have fully lined it so that I could trim everything down. But yeah, at the cuff I think this is acceptable. I have all of my pieces joined together, and I'm going to sew them together at a 1/4 of an inch. And as I say, the important part here is that we've got the wrong sides together, so 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and once that's sewn, trim everything down to an 1/8 of an inch. I have sewn my first line of stitching a 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, and I am now trimming all of that excess away, and I'm being particularly careful to be very close to that line of stitching that I've just put in, so it's just under an 1/8 of an inch that's left here. I'm going to do that the whole way round, and then I'm going to go and press this. I have pressed all of the seam allowance up towards the sleeve. That is the way that it's going to naturally want to go anyway, because you've got the bulk of the piping at the kind of like on the cuff. So once you've pressed everything, I'm not going to press it again. This time round, I'm going to just fold the cuff back in on itself and like kind of roll the edge over. You can see there's the seam allowance there, and it's kind of like there's an extra lip here, and that's because there's just so much bulk in there. That's fine. I did add extra length to this sleeve for it to fit me the way that I wanted it to. With my other one, I'm happy with where that's come out. I might go back and add like an extra maybe 1/4, 1/2 an inch, just to err on the side of caution if I do make this again. How many cotton robes does one person need though? But what I'm doing is just kind of like working the seam all the way around so that it is as rolled over as it can be. But I think you can see here there is basically, this is the 1/8 of an inch of fabric that was left over once we'd trimmed the excess of the seam allowance away. So I'm going to put my zipper foot onto my machine, and this line of stitching that you can see here, hopefully that white line of stitching you can see there is where we attached the piping earlier. And when we were attaching that piping, we were getting as close to the cord of the piping as we could and stitching over the previous stitching that had secured that piping inside of the fabric. So we want to be stitching as close to and on top of that line of stitching as we possibly can. So zipper foot with the needle all the way over to the left and just go the whole way around, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Hopefully you can see that I have gone over that previous line of stitching. So now we can reach through and pull our cuff out, and hopefully you should end up with something that looks like this. Now I'm going to go and give this a press, and the seam allowance is going to want to be up towards the sleeve side of things, and you want to leave it that way. I mean, theoretically you could press it down towards the cuff if you wanted to. It's not going to make that much of a difference, but the seam allowance kind of naturally wants to stay up towards the sleeve, so I'm just going to work with it. It's going to be an easier pressing job if I do it that way. So I'm going to go give this a press, and then we can move on to the collar. So I've decided not to quilt any of my collars, cuffs or belt pieces. I am just going to pipe the edges of mine. So the first thing that I want to do is interface them, and I have interfaced 2 of my collar pieces, as you can see here. So the next thing I'm going to do is pin together the short flat ends, and I'm going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do the same for the uninterfaced pieces as well. I have sewn the seams and pressed them open, so the next thing that I'm going to do is add the piping, which is step number 10. To add piping to the outer edge, and I have my piping here. Again, I'm just going to unspool a bunch from my roll and have it sat in my lap. I'm not going to do anything special to the ends of my piping yet, other than overlap it on the bottom edge just by a little bit, so I have a little bit extra to play with. I am going to get my zipper foot out, move my needle all the way over to the left, and sew on the line of stitching that you can just about make out there to secure the piping into place. And I want to be as accurate as I possibly can on that line of stitching because it's going to help us finish this off neatly later. I'm keeping the raw edge of the piping against the raw edge of the collar, and I'm going to go the whole way around. I have the piping attached, and it's going to look like that when it's all turned around. So the next step is technically to sew the other side of the collar together, but we've already done that. So now we're going to sandwich the piping between the 2 collar pieces. You want to sew up to the large circle on the collar, which is basically where the seam allowance meets. So I'm going to make a mark 5/8 of an inch away from this edge, 5/8 of an inch away from that edge, and that will give me the large circle that I'm looking for. I'm going to sew 2 there. The pattern wants you to taper the piping off at the ends of the collars here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the same thing that I did earlier. I'm going to trim my piping flush with the edge of my collar, and then I'm going to pull 5/8 of an inch of the actual cording out and cut that off so that I only end up with fabric in the seam allowance because of the way that the neckline gets finished with bias binding. And I am going to do mine slightly differently to the pattern's recommendation. That raw edges are all going to get caught in that, and I don't want to have it tapered off and have a bit of piping fabric floating free and not getting caught in that bias binding. So right sides together, match up the raw edges and the center back seam, pin everything into place, and then I'm going to sew from the interface side, and I'm going to basically just sew over that line of stitching that we've just done that secures the piping in place. And you want to be on as close to and on top of that line of stitching as you possibly can be, otherwise you'll end up with some of the, I believe this is called the flange of the piping being visible, which is not what we want. The collar pieces are sewn together, and now we need to do some trimming. So the first thing that I'm going to do is trim off the excess piping so that it is flush with the collar pieces. Then I'm going to grab my tweezers, pen and a little ruler. I've got my seam gauge here, this works really well, and I'm just going to grab hold of the core of my piping if I can, and I'm going to pull that out, and I want to chop off just over 5/8 of an inch. So just over 5/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to reposition that so that it is in the right place. And that just means that there's no bulky, not that the baker's twine is overly bulky, but there's no bulky twine in or piping cording in that particular part of the seam. So I'm going to do the same for the other side. And smooth that back down. So the final thing that I want to do is trim my seam allowances. Because this is curved, I'm going to do that with my pinking shears. That's my usual preference. You can do this in a number of ways. You can grade the seam allowances so that each layer that you've got here, and there's 4 because of the piping fabric, is slightly smaller going towards the outer fabric, so that when you press everything you don't end up with any bumps or lumps. But like I say, I prefer over a curved surface to use my pinking shears. So I'm going to go around and just clip through all of the layers of my collar and piping fabric seam allowance, and I'm leaving just over 1/4 of an inch there with the pinked edges. Once I've turned this through and pressed everything into place, I think it's going to allow the curve to sit nice and flatly, which is the ultimate goal. So I'm going to get that done the whole way around. Okay, all of the excess is taken off, and I can now turn this through and should end up with a beautifully piped collar. So I'm going to go and give this a press, and I want to prioritize the interface size because that's the right side of our garment. So I'm going to make sure that I'm pressing the raw edges of the under collar and the over collar together with the right side up, so the interface side up, just so that if there's any kind of little bits that show, they are all on the underside. So I'm going to go and get that completely pressed. My collar is pressed, and the most important thing here is that the raw edges are together. So I'm going to baste these because I really do want these to behave themselves when I'm sewing them into place. So I'm going to baste them all along the bottom edge at 3/8 of an inch, and I will just chop off that little excess bit of fabric there once that's been done. Then we can move on to the belt. For the view that I'm doing, which is the piped view, I need to sew the 2 pieces of the belt that I've cut together. And technically I should have been cutting this on the bias, but because of the amount of fabric I had and also the print, I decided to cut it on the straight of grain. I didn't have quite enough fabric to cut both of my pieces exactly the same length, so I had to piece one. So I've just added on a little extra piece of fabric here. So I have pinned 2 of the short ends together of the uninterfaced pieces. I'm going to do the same with the interfaced pieces. So I'm going to pin and sew both the interfaced and uninterfaced pieces at 5/8 of an inch. I have sewn it together and pressed the seam open, and so with the interface side I am going to add my piping. Same deal, I'm going to take a bunch off of the reel, put the reel in my lap, and I am going to start my piping not right on the center seam that I've just sewn because I don't want to add loads of bulk in the same area. So I'm going to start a little way down, kind of like halfway down the belt. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to do the same thing that I've done before. Oh, I've just got a little bit of a join there, so I'm going to cut that off because I don't need to have that extra little bit to work with later, especially when it's going to be put into a seam like that. So I'm going to match up the raw edges, and I'm going to leave myself about 5/8 of an inch, maybe just a little bit more than that, flapping free, so that's not going to get sewn down. I am going to put on my zipper foot, and I'm going to stitch over the line of stitching that has secured the cording inside of the fabric, as we've done before, and I will show you how I tackle the corners when I get to them. So as you can see, I've got my needle all the way over. I am stitching on top of this line of stitching, keeping
clipping the raw edges of the piping, even with the raw edge of the belt. So to go around corners, I have marked the 5/8 inch like cross point of the corner here. I've done the same on this one, but that first mark there was wrong. It's this one that I'm aiming for. So what I'm going to do is sew all the way up to and try and carefully match up and sew to that point. So when I get closer, I will keep the needle down and have a look and peel back the piping to see if I've hit that spot or not. Once I have, I'm going to keep the needle down and I'm going to clip into the piping flange here so that I can pivot around the corner. At least that is the plan. Let's give it a try. So I'm going to take a pin and just a little bit further back. So I'm going to take a pin and try and hit the mark that I have made. And I'm going to mark that with my friction pen so that I know exactly where I'm aiming. So with my needle down, I'm going to clip just the fabric of the piping up to where the needle is down, and then I'm going to move. So I'm hovering my foot, move everything around so that I can swing the piping around to go around the corner. Now it has wanted to kind of like go underneath, so I'm going to use my purple fang to readjust, and I'm not going to go directly at a right angle. I'm going to try and take a couple of stitches diagonally across the piping and then rearrange everything so that I can go in a straight line again. And I need to mark on the piping this corner, which I have got first time, which is always nice when that happens. The more you sew, the more you kind of get an eye for the seam allowance that you use most frequently. So I'm going to lower my presser foot back down, keep the raw edge of the piping against the raw edge of the belt, and sew up to that second mark that I've just made, which I've just hit. So I'm going to do the same thing again, snip up to that spot and swivel the piping. And again, there's just that little bit of excess. I'm going to take my purple fang and kind of finagle as best I can. And I'm going to take a couple of diagonal stitches and then all the way around. Now you might want to go back over this after you've got everything properly in place, because my very first one that I did, so yeah, you can see I didn't quite get the angle of the snip correct, so my stitching has gone a little wonky there, which if we turn this round is going to mean that there's a bit of the piping showing that I don't want. So I'm going to go back over and finesse this corner because I need to clip into it a little differently, but I'm going to need to clip off those excess pieces anyway. The second one came out much better. If you do need to go back and finesse
finagle and just finesse and refine things, then that's not the end of the world and you've basted things into place. So I'm going to keep sewing the rest of this piping on, and then we can finish off the ends like we did with the cuffs. I'm going to clip off my starting threads and I want to sew kind of to the end where the original piping starts, but I'm going to fold that back out of the way because I don't want to catch it. So to about there, and just back stitch. And again, clip off my threads. So I want to give myself enough fabric in my excess piece of piping so that I can turn that fabric back on itself. I'm just going to unpick the stitching back to where I have stopped my stitching. And as I said earlier, I purposefully did this stitching with a slightly larger stitch length so that it would be easy enough to unpick. I want to trim off my excess cording so that it hits where the other cording kind of ends, and it's best to trim up a little bit too much than a little bit too little. I want to fold back the raw edge of my piping fabric and then sandwich the other piece of piping in there, and I'm going to take a bit more of this cording out. Didn't cut off quite enough to start with, so fold back that edge, lay the original piece of piping down and fold that edge over so it looks like this, and then we'll just finesse this a little bit. Really great use of the purple thing. Make sure that everything is nice and flush, and then back under the presser foot to finish this off. So I'm going to backstitch again and just sew up to my previous line of stitching. Trim off my excess threads, and I'm pretty happy with 3 of my corners as I showed you, but there's one that I just didn't quite get the angle correct. These angles, they are better and I'm closer, as you can see, my stitching on my piping, but that first one that I tried went a little bit awry. It's not quite perfect, but only by a little bit, so I'm just going to chop off a little bit more. In fact, if I release that a little bit more, that's a bit better. It's going to sit a little bit flatter. There was just a little bit too much tension in the fabric there. I hadn't clipped quite far enough. But I'm just going to go back over and sew closer to that line of stitching because I'm a little bit far away. It's not the biggest of deals, and it probably would be fine. And again, it's an area that no one's really going to notice, but I am being a perfectionist. So now that I'm happy with all of my corners, so hopefully you can see there, I mean, I was off by like less than 1/8 of an inch, like a 1/16 of an inch, but I just think it would make for a nicer corner when I turn it all through. I'm not sure if there's a way to get your corners on piping really crisp and actually pointy, but that to me I'm very happy with. I've obviously got a lot of bulk fabric here because we're working with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is a large seam allowance. So the next thing that I need to do is sandwich my uninterfaced belt with my interfaced belt, and we are going to pin everything together, and we are going to sew from this side, the interface side, because you can see the previous lines of stitchings that we've got here, which is right next to the piping, so that will just mean that the piping is nicely enclosed. The thing you need to remember with this step is to leave yourself a window to turn this through. I think I've mentioned before, but I color code my pins, so I will put in 2 orange pins about 3 inches apart, and I'm doing this really roughly, but you'll get the idea. So yeah, about 3 inches apart. I'm going to start sewing here and then go all the way around and finish sewing here so that I have a nice opening to turn everything through. So that's the next step, which I will get done off camera because it is literally just sewing over that line of stitching that we've previously done. You want to take care around the corners to make sure that nothing gets puckered, but you do have a line of stitching to watch for. Just when you get to the corners, as you saw, there was a little bit of extra bulk, which when you turn it through will go around the corner nicely. Just when it's currently on the inside, it's just there. So make sure that you go around the corner carefully and you don't catch any of that excess cording in this stitching, because that won't look nice when you turn things through. I have sewn all the way around and left myself a gap. I need to trim down all of the seam allowances, especially around the corners, because otherwise they will definitely not sit nicely, because there is a lot of bulk in these areas. So I'm going to clip off the corners and trim down the seam allowances, and I've missed a bit, so go back and do that. And I'm going to do the same the whole way around the entirety of the belt, making sure that I am cutting off the excess and not cutting into the stitching line of anything. I'm going to get the entirety of that trimmed down and then we can turn it through. I have trimmed all the seam allowance off except for the opening, because I just find it easier to get a clean finish if there's a larger seam allowance there, and because I left it on a straight piece, not too close to any of the edges, I don't think that's going to be a problem. So now I just need to turn this all the way through, which is always a satisfying but lengthy process. So I'm going to speed it up for you guys. I am happy with those. I mean, they're not corners, they're rounds, but I'm happy with them. They look even. Piping looks even the whole way around. So I'm going to go and give this a press just to crisp everything up. It's all pressed and I'm very happy with how it's come out. So I just need to slip stitch this little part closed and then the belt is completely finished. So I'm going to get that done and then we can work on the bodice. Finally moving on to step number 5, technically, because all the previous steps are the quilting ones. So we're starting with the bodice and I'm going to sew in the bust darts. I have snipped into, no I haven't, I'm going to snip into my notches so that I can marry up those with their corresponding notches on. I have done those ones. I've done some of my notches, but yeah, some of my notches, but not all of them. So as you can see, I've still got all the pins on my pattern piece because I haven't marked the dart in yet. My preferred way of marking the dart is to take a pin and push it through the dart point, and I push it down through rather than sideways, because sideways you can sometimes skew where the point of the dart comes out, especially on the underneath layer of fabric. So now that I've got a pin in the point of the dart and I have clipped into the legs of the dart, I'm going to take the rest of the pins off of one side of the pattern piece, which means that I will be able to peel back my fabric. And that's the right side, that's the right side. I've had 2 different cuts of fabric and they have got slightly different print qualities, so I'm glad that I'm not making like a shirt dress out of this, because I think there might be some noticeable differences in the finished pieces. But as I say, I had 2 pieces of fabric. So I'm basically just using my friction pen to mark the point of my dart where the pin has gone through the layers of fabric. Now that I've done that, I can take the rest of the pins out, and that pin, I can put my pattern piece back into its folder. I'm gonna grab my ruler and I will join up that mark that I've made with the snips that I've made in the legs of the dart, and make sure that I find the actual dart leg, not the double notch. I've done that in the past and wondered why my darts came out so squiffy. Okay, so there's one. Now I'll do the other side. Now that I have my darts marked, I can pin them. Kind of like to grab the point and then bring the dart legs together. And I'm going to be sewing from the end of the dart towards the point, so I want to pin in a way that that's going to be possible. Put my pin through and make sure that it is lining up with the line that I just drew underneath. Then I'll pin the point of my dart, and then I'll put a few other pins in just to make sure that everything is matching up. And I'll do the same for the other piece. Okay, now that everything is pinned, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning of the dart legs, sew all the way to the point and sew off the end, leave myself nice long thread tails. Once both darts are done, I can tie those thread tails into a knot, trim off the excess and press the darts downwards. So the next step is number 6, stitch bodice back to bodice front at shoulders and sides. I'm going to do this with French seams, so it's just a slightly different order of operations to what the pattern requests. So this is the wrong side and that's the right side. So with wrong sides together, you want to lay out your bodice pieces. Oh, like so. Oh, they don't look too... I was a bit worried that they were going to look very, very, very different. This one is slightly fainter than this one, but it's not too bad. And I didn't have enough fabric to 100% pattern match, so what I tried to do was cut everything so that the motif was running across the pattern at the same height, which I think I have managed. I'm going to pin the 2 shoulder seams, the 2 side seams, and then sew those at 1/4 of an inch. Trim everything, press everything, and then sew them at 3/8 of an inch to finish off the French seams. And I'll just talk through quickly the direction I press everything when I get there. So shoulder seams, side seams, pinned together, sewn at 1/4 of an inch, trimmed, pressed, sewn at 3/8 of an inch, and then pressed. This really was not the best of fabrics to pick for to sew along, but I have finished the French seams and I have pressed the shoulder seams towards the back, and I've also pressed the side seams towards the back. If you remember when we did the sleeve seams, we pressed those towards the front so that we could nest the underarm seams when I French seamed the sleeves in. So all of our component parts are now assembled, so we can start constructing the final garment. So we can skip all these steps because we've already done them, and we can go to step 14. Pin collar to neck edge, right side up, matching notches, centre backs, circles and triangles. Clipping garment neck edge where necessary and basted. We've got the bodice here, and then I have my collar here. Now I put a pin in the right side of my collar so that I could easily identify it because I have basted the 2 edges together. But the right side of your collar is going to be your interfaced side, so you can just peel back the seam allowance and have a look at that. So we're putting the wrong side of the collar to the right side of the bodice, and we're matching up the notches. The triangles on the collar will match up with the shoulder seams. Then you also want to match up the centre back seam of the collar with the centre back of the bodice piece. So I'm going to get that all pinned into place, and then I will stitch along the 3/8 of an inch basting line that I have previously done on the collar. The collar is on, and the important thing to note here is the large circle, which is the end of the collar, has been placed against the large circle on the edge of the bodice, and this just allows this seam allowance to be put into the skirt without the collar interfering. So the pattern now wants us to finish this edge with bias binding. I am going to do that, but it has a different finish for the skirt, which I'm not a fan of. I want the bias binding to go all the way around the opening, so I'm going to skip these steps. I'm going to move over to step 29 because we've already made the sleeves. So I'm going to grab my sleeves, which are here. Step 29 is this one, and it says, with right sides together, pin sleeve into armhole edges, matching notches, underarm seams, small circles and large circle to shoulder seam. Adjust ease, based stitch, stitch again 1/4 inch away in the seam allowance, trim close to second stitching, press seam allowance flat, turn seam allowance towards sleeve. So I'm going to French seam mine, which means that we need to put the wrong side of the sleeve to the wrong side of the bodice and sew our first line of stitching. So I'm going to turn my sleeves to the wrong sides to start with, and then I need to find the corresponding sleeve that I want to sew into the bodice. So I've got my double notch here, which is the back, which means that it's going to go into this sleeve hole. And because I pressed my sleeve seam towards the front and my bodice seam towards the back, I can nest the underarm seams, which will help with the bulk in that area. And this is wrong sides together. Now, as you will remember from the pattern alteration portion of this, I have added width to this sleeve to make it more comfortable for my current arm measurement. So I'm not going to be super surprised if my notches don't quite match up, which these ones just a little bit out. But what I'm going to do is pin my sleeve in wrong sides together all the way around until I get to the beginning of my base or my gathering stitches, my ease stitching that I put in earlier. Now, as I mentioned, I've added extra width to the sleeve, so I'm going to end up with like a little puff at the top of my sleeve cap, which is something that I like the look of, so it's not the end of the world for me. There is a small circle on the bodice which will match up with the small circles on your sleeves if you want to do that, but basically the small circle is where the gathering stitches start. If you just pin the sleeve in flatly, then that will theoretically and logically match up with the small circle on the bodice, so you don't necessarily have to put that in. But there are markings on the bodice for sleeve installation if that makes you a little bit more confident putting your sleeve in. So on this side the single notch matched up perfectly, so I'm just going to do the same thing, pin my sleeve all the way around to where the ease stitching starts. And then once I've got that all pinned in, I'm then going to switch over and pin what is the large circle, but as I mentioned, I don't use a large circle for sleeves. I use a notch just because it's a easier and more definitive like sign for me, because I use friction pens to make all my markings and I iron things, so I don't want my friction pens to disappear. So a little notch is going to match up with the shoulder seam and pin that into place, and then I will start pulling on my E-stitches to gather up the excess. And like I say, there is going to be a lot of excess in this sleeve because I have added extra width to it for comfort, and I'm going to concentrate that extra width into very dense gathers at the top of the sleeve cap, because that's a look that I like. It just makes sewing the sleeve in that little bit easier for me. I'm going to get that all pinned in, and then I'll do the same for the other side. Okay, so I've got the very dense gathers right at the sleeve cap and everything else is pinned in smoothly. So I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch, the same way that I do with any French seam. I'm going to start at the underarm seam and go the whole way around. I like to sew with the bodice towards the feed dogs and the sleeve under the presser foot because I've got so many gathers up there. I want to make sure that they behave nicely. That's just my preference. You can sew it in the other way if you wish to, whichever works for you. So I'm going to get that done for both sleeves, trim all the excess off, press it and sew it at 3/8 inch, and that will finish the French seaming of the sleeves into the bodice. The sleeves are set in with French seams, and now I'm going to remove all the gathering stitches from the sleeve caps because some is going to be visible in the garment. Then I just want to remove this one as well just to take any extra thread out, so I'm going to do that for both sides. Personally, I don't actually press my sleeves. I kind of think that they look slightly better without being pressed, but that's just my preference. If you do want to press your sleeve, I find that that French seams tend to like to sit on the inside of the garment, but you can force them to sit on the sleeve side if you would like. It's just your preference, but I'm not going to press that seam. It's the only seam in any garment that I don't press, but I'm not going to do it. So I'm going to take the gathering stitches out, and then we can attach the bodice to the skirt. We can move on to step number 33. Pin skirt to bodice right sides together, matching notches, centres, seams and circles, clipping skirt where necessary, stitch again 1/4 inch away in seam allowance, trim close to second stitching, press seam allowance towards skirt, continuing to front edge. Yeah, I'm going to French seam mine because of course I am. We want the wrong side of the skirt to the wrong side of the bodice, and we have, when we made the skirt earlier, basted our pocket bags to the waistlines so that they will behave nicely. So we're going to line up all of the different parts, so the side seams, centre back and the front, and sew all the way around at a 1/4 inch, the same you would do with any other French seam. Now the skirt seam is a little bit curved, so you may need to clip into those curves to get everything to sit into place. I want to sew with the skirt seam under the presser foot and the bodice seam under the feed dogs because there is extra fabric in the skirt to ease around, so I want to make sure that it's behaving itself nicely. We have pressed the side seams of the bodice towards the back, and we had to press the side seams of the skirt towards the front because of the French seam pocket, so these seams will also nest nicely. Waistband is French seamed in, and I have pressed it down towards the skirt. So the pattern would now have you do a narrow rolled hem on the front edges of the skirt portion, but as I've left off the bias binding so that I can continue it the entire way around, we're going to skip that step. I've decided to use some hot pink bias binding because I think it's going to kind of like go really nicely with the hot pink piping that I've used, and this is currently looking like a giant mass of fabric because there's 5 meters of fabric here. I'm using a pre-made bias binding that I got from eBay, and I will link to the ones that I use in the description down below. I'm going to put the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm going to open up the binding, matching up the raw edges, and all the way around I'm going to stitch in the ditch to encase or to do my first pass of binding for the entirety of the front opening. So this is the hem of the skirt. I'm going to go all the way around the back neckline down to the other side of the hem of the other side of the skirt. As I say, I'm sewing in the ditch, so 1/4 inch away from the raw edges, and it's the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the garment for the first pass. Giant mass of fabric. I have bound the edge of the front of the dressing gown, so now I want to go over and press all of the seam allowance into the bias binding. Then I'm going to wrap it over like that so that I can top stitch this edge down. I like to use my number 5 foot, which is a blind hem foot, because it has a central blade in it which I can run against the edge of the bias binding to make sure that I have an even top stitch all the way around. There is a number 10 foot for a Bernina, which is a edge stitch foot in particular, so you might want to use that one if you have access to that. But a blind hem foot tends to work quite well because it does have, as I say, this just blade here that you can run against the edge of the bias binding to make sure that everything is even. But as I say, the first thing I'm going to do is press all of the seam allowance into the bias binding so that I can then wrap this over and top stitch this down. I have bound the entire edge all the way around. I'm now going to go and press the bias binding under, and once I've done that I will be able to top stitch it into place to finish off the front neckline. The thing that I want to make sure that I'm doing when I do this is that I am not top stitching down the collar, so I'm going to be making sure that the collar is completely out of the way when I do my top stitching, but I need to press this first to make sure that it sits on the inside nicely. So I'm going to go press this and then we can top stitch it all the way around. I have decided to go for hot pink top stitching because it will blend in better to the bias binding. I just like the addition of extra pink in this, to the point where I'm actually thinking about maybe going around the belt and top stitching this as well, and possibly even the top of the cuffs, just to kind of like tie it all together. Whilst that's not needed for any of these things because they're all finished and enclosed and sitting where they should be, it could look quite nice, but I'm not sure. One thing I am going to do, because basically all I've got to do now is hem it. They want me to do a narrow rolled hem, which I am going to do. But the other thing that they want me to do is make a thread loop for the belt. I don't like thread loops. I find them flimsy and annoying, and they're just not my favourites. So I have somewhere, probably, yes, there, I've got some extra pieces of fabric. So what I'm going to do is actually make some belt loops. I need them to be at least as wide as the belt itself, which is 2 3/4 inches wide from piping to piping. So I want my belt loops to be 3 inches, which means that I need the piece of fabric for the way that I want to make it 6 inches wide plus seam allowance. So I'm going to cut it 7 inches wide, or 7 inches long and 2 inches wide, and I'm going to cut 2 of those. So I'm going to go and get that done. I'll show you how I'm going to use those to add belt loops to the dressing gown. I have cut my pieces 2 inches by 7 inches long, and then I have folded them in half and pressed them, and folded the raw edges in and pressed them in again. So it started like that and it's ended up as a 1/2 inch wide, 7 inch long piece of fabric. I'm going to unfold all the edges and I'm going to stitch the right sides together along the short edge on both of them at a 1/2 inch, then fold everything back up again so I can top stitch all the way around to enclose all the folded edges. So unfold everything, right sides together, and stitch along the short end at 1/2 inch. I have sewn it into a loop and then I have top stitched both the folded edge and the open edge just so that it is nice and even. I have also double checked to make sure that the belt fits through, and it does, with a decent amount of ease there as well, so it's not too tight. So the next thing I'm going to do is attach these to my dressing gown. So I'm going to take my belt loop and find my side seam, and I'm going to sew it on. I'll show you what that looks like, because again, I've really picked a terrible fabric for seeing details in what I'm doing, but hopefully the instructions are helpful enough. But I'll give you a close-up of the exact positioning that I've chosen for my belt loop once they're attached. I have sewn on my belt loops, and I've done it so that they are quite loose so that the belt won't be restricted in it in any way. I did the first line of stitching 3/4 inch down from the waistline, and this is towards the center front, and I did the second line of stitching 2 inches up from that, so 1 1/4 inches up from the waistline. So it's 3/4 inch down and 1 1/4 inches up, 2 inches apart in total. And I just went backwards and forwards to secure it into place. So now that that's all done, I can do a narrow rolled hem around the hem of the skirt. The first thing that you need to do for a narrow rolled hem is find the starting edge of your hem, and I'm going to sew a line of stitching 1/4 inch away from the raw edge so that I will have a pressing guide for the next step. So 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. I have sewn my line of guide stitching at 1/4 inch and then I have pressed it under. I'm now going to top stitch really close to that folded edge all the way around so that I can trim off the excess and press it up again. I'm going to trim off any little scraggly bits as well. But yeah, I'm going to top stitch as close to the edge as I possibly can get all the way around the hem. I've sewn my second line of stitching to secure that folded edge down, and I'm just now going along and trimming off the excess so that it's going to be easy to turn up this circular hem one more time, press it into place and stitch it down. The reason that I'm doing it this way is because it is a circular hem, so either bias binding or a narrow roll hem tends to be the best way to finish something like this. So I'm going to continue taking off all of the excess from the entirety of the hem, which is quite large, and then I will press it up again and top stitch it into place. I have finished my narrow rolled hem, and that means that the dressing gown is complete. And that's the sew along. I hope you enjoyed. I hope everything was clear enough. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if there are any parts that were unclear because of the nature of this fabric, the right and wrong side of this were not easy to tell apart. I do appreciate that. I do have standalone videos for all of the techniques for French seams themselves, for French seaming inseam pockets, and there is a dedicated piping tutorial video coming out very, very soon, which will all be linked in the description down below. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And don't forget to use the hashtag Sean made me do it if you do make one of these yourself, because I would absolutely love to see which fabrics you've picked for your lovely lightweight summer dressing gown. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.